All right, it's a little late here, but I want to talk about this while it's still kind of fresh. OpenAI had their Dev Day inaugural, I'm assuming it'll be a recurring thing, this week, which came with a flurry of new announcements and shifts and model updates. And in response to that, I've seen what I'll call a lot of pretty bad takes on what the announcements will and won't enable. So I wanted to offer a little bit of a counterpoint and maybe respond to some of the things I've seen, because I think it's easy to get caught up in the flurry and the hype and not realize or think through what might be actually under the surface or what something might actually mean for applying this stuff for real world use cases. So first, let's kind of break down the updates this week into maybe two distinct categories. First, GPT-4 Turbo, which is a huge advancement from OpenAI in terms of their context window. You've probably read we're going from either 8K or a limited beta 32K context window to 128K, which is pretty crazy. I think the clear benefit here is now we have some competition in the large context window space between multiple model providers, Anthropic with Claude and the 100K tokens, and now OpenAI up in that same kind of territory. The model that we build on and the kind of royal we there, not just Zero Width, but I think in general in this kind of community, I think will continue to evolve and continue to get better. And from Zero Width's perspective, that's why one of our priorities has been to remain as agnostic to the models as we possibly can. Even in our workbench, there's a little drop down where you can pick from a variety of models from not just one provider, but we have Google's and OpenAI's been in there integrated so that you can easily swap back and forth between the models and kind of control and tinker with the parameters and settings afforded by each one. The win, I think, in this space is not, wow, great, big new model, but it is, more competition in the model providing space. I think everybody wins when there are more players competing and leveling the playing field. So that's a great thing. What I am a little skeptical about is how effective the actual calls will be and model memory will be at those really large token lengths. Having spent much of today interacting with the new model, I still think it starts to fall apart as the context window gets pretty huge. Not terribly. Obviously, there's a huge leap forward still that's going on. But I don't think that just because we're shifting from 8K to 128K, that completely throws something like RAG and a retrieval augmented system out the window. It does shift and change when you might need to leverage one of those things. But I don't think that design pattern is going to go away. If you don't know what I'm talking about there with RAG, we'll do more kind of deep dive videos on that. But in short, RAG is a technique for breaking up information or knowledge that isn't necessarily in the base LLM that you want to enable it to use to accomplish a certain task. That might be data you're bringing that's proprietary to your company, unique to you, some larger text data set that you want to provide the model to contextually leverage, but not necessarily put through the model to retrain the raw weights of the actual LLM, which should be more in the fine-tuning category. So when we get these bigger models, I think some of the instinct might be that we don't have to lean on a RAG design approach as much anymore. I don't think that that's necessarily true. One of the big providers of a component of what I'll call the kind of RAG ecosystem in this space is a company called Pinecone. Zero Width, our workbench, leverages Pinecone, and they offer a vector database solution. And I think one of their developer advocates, I can't remember their role, a guy named James Briggs, has a great slide and diagram that I'll put on the screen here that talks about how a large language model really needs an ecosystem to enable it to operate at scale in the real world for real kind of customized applications. On its own, the language model is just fancy autocomplete. So that ecosystem, one component of that is the retrieval augmented generation design pattern, I'll call it. And these bigger models are going to let us have a more flexible way of managing that knowledge. We're going to have to not lean on it as much, but I think we're still going to need to consider carefully how you go about defining the things you want a model to know Just as an example, we've been alpha testing our workbench with a class at Berkeley of design students, a course called Technology Design Foundations. And each student individually has leveraged our workbench to interact with the language model, prime it with some custom instructions, build a retrieval augmented system using the workbench, bringing their own knowledge, their own unique proprietary information to it to set up a language model to accomplish a specific task, and then launch that just in a matter of about a week for each one of their projects. We talked a lot in those classes around not just what the RAG design is for, but how you develop methods for deciding how big an individual piece of information should be. If you have to take the entirety of your company's internal intellectual property and divide it up into pieces, how big should each piece be? How much information does it take to define a source of truth? Whether maybe you're defining a method or a standard best practice for a particular capability, or a training guideline for somebody or a particular role, or an interview technique, or a coding best practice. How much text does it take to do that? Now, all these documents so far that define those things are often currently organized in what I'll call like a legacy format. And that's not just saying they aren't digital, but even their digital structure is often organized in a way that is intended for it to be possibly printed or possibly presented in a slideshow. So the cadence and way information is broken up in the way that it's stored at scale in these companies or in organizations doesn't reflect the way you might want to interact with it and break it up to provide it to a language model to tackle a particular problem. Now, when we get into these super large models, that becomes a much easier problem to potentially solve. Maybe I can put the entirety of a 20-page PDF into the context window to have a model answer a given question for somebody, or leverage a piece of information or a more dynamic set to accomplish a specific task. But what it doesn't necessarily solve is indexing that PDF and doing it in such a way that makes it easy to find amongst a sea of maybe many thousands based on its really specific topic. That's another kind of component and aspect of the strategy that isn't necessarily solved here. So all that being said, large model, good. Models will keep getting bigger. The context windows will keep getting better. I hope that there is continued competition in this space. I would love to see 3 or 4 providers of equally competitive models. OpenAI has been a leader in terms of their model quality and the model extensibility in terms of the way you can have it call functions and interact with other things is much, much further ahead than any other provider, even though they were lacking a little bit in the context window. Now that they've taken that leap forward in context window, and now that Anthropic has gotten the huge funding that it's gotten from, I think, Google and Amazon most recently, I think you'll see a leap forward in those other aspects of somebody like Claude that go beyond just, now it's 200,000 tokens, to Claude can call functions, Claude can interact with the web, those kinds of other things. The other major announcement from OpenAI were the creation of their kind of GPT platform, that they, through their web interface, anybody can actually interact with ChatGPT to have it build custom instructions to create a new focused task-specific GPT. I think this is being broadly misinterpreted by a lot of people. This has been something that's been largely doable via OpenAI's API since much earlier this year, for many, many months. In fact, the Zero With Workbench lets you do this. You can easily give a large language model some instructions. You can choose Google's models and do the same thing, set up a chat-like interface and launch it, and interact with a model that has a very different tone of voice, or that is focused on a new, particular set of skills that you've armed it with that are beyond what the model came with. And that way of interacting and customizing a model and then launching it is not really that new. The kind of appification that OpenAI is doing to try and create this GPT store where anybody can come and, again, talk to a chatbot to build a chatbot is a pretty interesting shift. There's some language on OpenAI's website that talks about how they want to enable a broader set of people beyond just people with deep technical skills to interact with and build these things, which I completely agree with. That's been a huge position of Zero With. That's why we are working with design students to help them craft and design intelligence, not technologists to do this. The developers who are curious about this stuff are already hands-on with these APIs. They're already tinkering with it. It is extremely easy to get into if you have a small, set of experience with web development. It's very, very trivial. What now is happening is the non-technical folks, product designers, strategists, copywriters, creatives, whomever, are offered another way into this space. That's fantastic. I think that is overall a broadly amazing thing, and that's also what we want to do here at ZeroWidth. The thing that I think is kind of interesting and is telling in the examples even that OpenAI lists on their website of the possible potential uses is that as the barrier of entry falls and anyone is able to go to ChatGPT and build their own version of it to accomplish a specific thing, the supply of these unique things is going to just explode. And I think what is likely going to happen is you will have, just using some of the examples on OpenAI's website, 40 different versions of the laundry stain remover GPT bot, 5,000 different math trainers. And you'll see this kind of explosion that is not dissimilar to the App Store in 2007, which is something I think I've seen many people make a comparison to, like, wow, this is like Apple launching the App Store. Now, I would want to counter that point by asking anybody to look at statistics today of how many times a month people download an app. We're going to see this huge flood and almost coding of a technology first way through figuring out use cases for this stuff. Now that this, kind of revolutionary technology is widely available, let's just apply it everywhere we possibly can, because why not? Maybe we'll be the first mover there and we'll get something out of it. Even OpenAI talking about rev share. People are already thinking how much somebody might pay them for their own version of a thing that it might be fairly trivial for somebody else to also make in the same platform. I think there's a couple of things that might happen here. One, first, and I think this is kind of maybe solvable by OpenAI in terms of how they structure the interface, how you actually interact with these things. I've been playing around with this today, and I didn't find it super great at navigating over to now I want to use the data analysis one, and now I'm ready to go use the games designing one. I think that breakup in terms of the use cases for these chatbot applications and like choose which chatbot you want to talk to feels really dated, and it feels really behind the times of what the technology actually offers and should be able to afford. I also think that it is maybe perpendicular to the way I, as a human interacting with this thing, might think about what I want the thing to be able to do. My needs are not as discrete as that. I think the mode and behavior of a typical user there doesn't align to that exact way of thinking. Again, I think that's probably navigatable by OpenAI in terms of how they structure their kind of portal and how you choose which ones you want to talk to and whatnot. The other aspect of this that I think will be a bigger tell is what you've seen in past, big tech hype cycles. As somebody who was working professionally at applying Internet of Things from the early days of making our own sensors and wiring up our own breadboards and trying to figure out how to do indoor GPS with Bluetooth before BLE 4.0, that hype cycle went from this is amazing, the tech's getting smaller, everything's going to be able to talk to everything, to very quickly, Samsung, your refrigerator has a TV on it, to the little Amazon reorder buttons that they expected to have us scattered all over our house so we could easily click when we needed more detergent by the washer and push a button when we were ready to order more Ritz crackers in our pantry. That tech forward identifying of the use case is going to kind of flood and spread out to the point where we will find all of the ways that we as people don't want to interact with this stuff. I think you can similarly look at the way AI generated imagery has been interpreted and considered by audiences over the last year and a half. From early DALL-E and Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, there was this kind of explosion of we didn't know that this was possible, to now a almost memification of it. It is so easy to do and everywhere that the material itself almost becomes useless. And now we're just beginning to, I think, identify the really pointy, specific ways that it can be used to actually enable and provide a benefit to somebody in their role, whether that is a very, very specific, product design or prototyping ideation, whether that is the stuff that Corridor Digital was doing with generating, anime off of stills of a video frame. Those kinds of very relevant, specific uses of a new era of technology don't come from this initial flood that is going to happen. They come from a deep, careful consideration and understanding of a particular use case, problem, pain point, component of a value chain, and working closely with the people who are currently navigating that to actually understand how and where this technology could enable their lives to be made better, to be made easier, to be made more effective at their job, at their work, at whatever. So I am excited about the models. I think model growth and competition is fantastic. I think the broader reaction to the GPT platform, as this is how you're going to get your AI automated agent swarm thing, is very off base. Another concern I kind of have with the way that they are sketching this out, and this is actually something that we tinkered with and have been exploring for our own workbench, again, where you can do some of these exact same things, give a language model custom instructions, task it in a specific way, connect it to a broad knowledge set that you manage independently and deploy it in real applications. The actual writing of those instructions is a pretty careful and considered task. I said in the talk I gave at Berkeley, prompt engineering is not a job, but prompt writing very much is a skill. Having GPT-4 write those instructions for you, even a first draft. I know that I think they're editable manually, but having that first interaction and that initial way into designing your own language model via another language model isn't exactly going to cause model collapse. Like, we aren't training a model on itself necessarily, but I do think it's going to kind of potentially cause a little bit of use case collapse. I know the decision at OpenAI is coming from a place of trying to make it an easier way in, and it is. I think the demo that they did in building that out is a much more friendly front door to beginning to think about this stuff. But once you're there, once you're in the weeds and trying to do this at scale for real clients and for real world applications, not just a friendly laundry stain chatbot, the weeds of those instructions become extremely important. And how you refine and nudge and reiterate and focus the language model on a given task actually performs differently across the various models or providers you might be using. And when you have GPT-4 do it for GPT-4, I have a little bit of a concern that it is not necessarily going to cause some kind of massive failure, because again, we're not changing the raw model here, we're just prompting it in the same way that you can kind of tell somebody's been generating text from GPT today just by kind of recognizing its writing style. I think we'll also see some of that in terms of the way the use cases show up. So I don't necessarily think that that's the most effective way in long term. That's not too dissimilar to me from Apple making the early design of the interface of the iPhone buttons look very 3D and like physical objects you touch, to kind of train and teach us as new users of this technology and medium how to interact with it. And as we became comfortable with that, things began to get flatter and less important, that this thing has a huge drop shadow and indents when you push on it. I think that's maybe a similar thing that's happening here. As we were thinking today about a large language model, if someone is brand new at this in this space and trying to think about, well, what can I even get it to do, simply having a conversation with another expert, in this case another large language model, that can teach them what a language model could and couldn't do is a way in that does make sense. All of that being said, as we get this kind of flood of GPTs, there, just like there is now kind of an app for everything, and that hype cycle is way faded, and there was a connected at-home IoT device for everything, and then there was a blockchain application for everything. We are at the phase of now there will be a GPT for kind of everything you could possibly dream up. And as I said before, once all of those technical barriers are broken down, what's left to actually define what makes one of these applications of a technology good from another is not the core technology that's behind it anymore. It's the deep understanding of the use case. It's a really careful consideration of the strategy and design pattern and interaction design, and an emphasis on really the human-centered nature of that experience. And I think here at Zero With, we're focused really on that space of the conversation. We are not in the LLM creation space right now. We are going to continue to be as model agnostic as we possibly can and evaluate these things as they come out. But I think our focus is going to remain at that strategy element. How do you identify what is a good application of this technology? As I say to clients all the time, this stuff is not just chat. Not everything needs to be a virtual assistant. I can tell you already there is huge burnout in the yet another chatbot space for this stuff, and there is a little bit heavier lean on how do we embed these things as processes? How do we let this actually take actions, be monitoring something, and alert me when I need to care about it, instead of offering me a front door to come ask a question and get an answer back as a kind of expert assistant at a particular task. So that was a bit of a ramble. There is a bunch more coming from us. We're going to do some more tutorials, part 2 of the food tutorials coming up, where we're going to take the max potential stars that we had the language model assigning to each of the items in our food delivery app order and use those to actually write text that could be inserted into the interface of the app, an application of a language model that is nothing to do with the chatbot, but instead this invisible layer that more highly contextualizes and personalizes a potential real user interface in an application that we're highly familiar with. We're going to be digging way into that and building out the aspects of our workbench that don't just talk about the technology and instructions aspect, but really in that use case identifying space. We've been working on a bunch of frameworks and methods for understanding the different levers and ways to rank or rate or qualify a potential use case in the enterprise space for this stuff. We're going to try to take that work and turn it into a whole aspect of our workbench and interface for these cross-functional teams like the ones we're working with, to be able to work through the massive amount of ideas and use cases that they come up with to identify what are the right ones to begin to tackle and to work on. So I'm super excited about this space still. It's been a big week on the tech half of this conversation. I think there's relevant and deserved focus there in understanding and trying to figure out what that means for the space. I'm really excited about the strategy half. And how do we make good, relevant, quality use of this technology for real problems that go beyond putting a fridge on my TV and a button on my laundry machine to order more dish detergent? So stay tuned, hit subscribe if you haven't already. I think I'll also try and do a little bit of a redo of the kind of hour-long lecture and hour-long demo tutorial of our workbench that we gave at Berkeley a couple weeks ago to set up that class, because I think there's some relevant information there beyond the context of just that particular course that's worth sharing and talking about here, especially as we get closer to opening up our workbench for basically anybody to come in and begin to tinker and work on designing that ecosystem that goes around the large language model and evaluating and working on the use cases for how to make this stuff actually relevant out in the world. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned, and we will see you next time.
All you got to do is repeat after me. GPT. It's easy as 1, 2, 3. Do, re, mi, G.